This week on Snark Squad Pod, we are joined once again by the Democracy Diva to talk about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. Welcome back to Snark Squad Pod. I'm Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marinez, and today we are joined once again by Sam, the Democracy Diva.
Hey guys, it's me, Sam. I am thrilled to be back and figuring out a way to keep everyone talking about A Song of Ice and Fire.
Well, today that is taking the form of some novellas that George R.R. Martin wrote instead of writing the end. I'm already salty. Yeah. So these three novellas were wrapped up into one book called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and we have this tradition of Sam giving the synopsis when we're doing things for A Song of Ice and Fire. So Sam, are you ready for this?
I am. I also feel like for some reason this is going to take way longer than the ones for the actual books do, even though this is like 1/100th of the size. But it's a lot harder when you can't just jump around from being like, and then Arya does things. Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, I am ready to do this. So I'm going to take them one by one. So the first novella is called The Hedge Knight. It starts about 90 years before the events that we're familiar with in A Game of Thrones. We meet a very gigantic teenage boy named Dunk, who's mourning the knight that he used to serve. He finds a tourney to compete in and meets a young bald boy who basically likes stowaways to become his squire. We meet a nice prince named Baelor Targaryen, and we meet a mean prince named Aerion Targaryen, and all of these names sound the same after a while, so bear with me. Our hero Dunk gets a crush on a Dornish puppeteer girl named Tansel, and he sees the bad prince Aerion attacking her, and he flips out, intervenes to save her, beats the shit out of a prince, gets arrested, decides to do a trial by combat, and then Aerion is like, oh no, it has to be a trial by 7, which is just like trial by combat on steroids. So this poor little hedge knight from Flea Bottom has to find like fancy lords who are willing to fight with and die for him, which is difficult. And so Prince Baelor, the good prince, decides to join Dunk's team and fight against his relatives. But he ends up getting his skull caved in by his brother Prince Maekar. And Maekar feels really bad about that and gives Dunk a place in his household to train his son, also known to us as the little bald stowaway boy named Egg, who is actually Aegon the 5th Targaryen, I want to say. Let's go with 5. That's basically the first novella. The second one is The Sworn Sword. There's a drought, and there's an evil lady named the Red Widow who stole the water of Sir Eustace, the knight that Dunk is working for. He goes to the Red Widow, who he expects to be some old scary lady, but surprise, she's young, hot, and a ginger. And also that water actually belongs to her. And actually it's Sir Eustace who sucks and used to be a traitor to the throne. And then at some point, Dunk makes out with the Red Widow, and even though the Red Widow and Sir Eustace, the old knight, hate each other, they end up bonding and getting married, and both of them like live happily ever after. And Dunk is like, oh, okay, bye, I guess. And also, can I have your braid? So that's a weird book. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. And then the last one, which I think is my favorite, is The Mystery Knight. And this is where Dunk and Egg meet some hedge knights named John the Fiddler and Alan Cockshaw. Sure. And John is super nice to Dunk and invites him to join them at this tourney at a wedding that they're going to. And there's a dragon's egg as the prize, which is cool and also thematically important. And Egg immediately, the person Egg, not the object Egg, immediately realizes, like, there's a lot of people at this party who fought for the Blackfyres in the last rebellion, which is the bastard branch that fought against the Targaryens for the throne. But of course, Dunk ignores him for the whole book and turns out to be wrong because Egg knows everything. So there's a wedding and a feast, and everybody gets super drunk, and John the Fiddler hits on Dunk for like an entire scene, but Dunk is very dumb and doesn't realize that. And he has all these dreams about a dragon bursting from the egg, and there's basically plots within plots at this tourney of people betting on jousts and losing on purpose. And also they're actually all there to start another Blackfyre rebellion, because it turns out that John the Fiddler is actually the Blackfyre King Daemon's son, who's also named Daemon. And there's a stolen dragon egg, and
it's like
Egg,
a real
the person,
lack of creativity and naming.
it's Don't fucking get me started on that. If we ever recap Fire and Blood, I have things to say about that. But basically, Egg, as in little boy Egg, disappears. But it turns out he actually convinced all the rebels, like, hey, my father the prince is on his way with his big army, so you guys should probably stop plotting rebellions. And he basically terrifies all these grown men into submission, which is great. And then it turns out that, yeah, John the Fiddler is actually a Targaryen, and basically his boyfriend wanted to murder Dunk because Daemon Targaryen thought Dunk was super hot, which, like, based on the graphic novel, same. And then Bloodraven, aka Brynden Rivers, shows up, which we're definitely going to talk about, and basically gives Dunk some money and punishes the bad guys, and we put a happy bow on the novellas. So somehow, I think that was a summary of the novellas. I'm not totally sure.
You did it. You did the thing.
Well, I mean, the novellas seem to function largely as, I'm going to tell you this like really basic, simple story, but it's also a way of me, George R. R. Martin, dropping in, I thought a lot about the world and the lineages. So here's all this random history, tucked into what is otherwise a fairly straightforward and simple story of these two characters just like wandering around on the road together. So I understand why it is difficult to do a synopsis of, because it's a lot less straightforward in terms of like the events that happened are more simple, but especially after reading all of the other books and everything else, like getting to this one, the things that are important in it, it's like that's like kind of more complicated than just here are straightforward, this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
Yeah, I mean, these are three, like, fairy tale, like Don Quixote, like, old school style, like, tales. But what matters in them appears to be none of the actual plot that happens. Right. And mostly all the stuff going on in the background, that because you're in Dunk's head and Dunk is extremely dumb, you really have no idea what's
like
going on.
Extremely dumb.
Oh,
like
Dunk.
The last one was just, like the last novella in particular, like waiting for him to get to the realization of who the fiddler was just like by the time when he realizes it, when he cops to realizing it, I was horrified that he hadn't realized it sooner. I was like, surely you just like didn't actually say it out loud. But no, he didn't know. He really just never once put those ideas together. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself though, because where we begin. Did you like this? How did you feel about this?
I did enjoy it. I think I had I feel like we finished reading the books a long time ago. I know that's not actually a thing, but we read them, every other month for a while. And so it felt like there was an emptiness, almost like, hey, remember these books you dedicated many, many hours to? So going back to the novellas, it was like, it felt cool to be back in the world. And I immediately, figuring out who Egg was. And then I started looking up at lineage stuff. And then I was impressed all over again about the scope of what George R. R. Martin has created. And then we got to like the 17th instance of Dunk the Lunk, thick as a castle wall. And I was like, oh, I remember what I don't like about these things. It's like the repetition and, oh man, did we need all of this? Probably not. So for the most part, I was just happy to be back in the world. But then every once in a while, George would just remind me that he does great with, the history 300 years back or even more, I'm sure, and all of the lineage. But, his writing is sometimes just fine. It's okay.
I mean, I enjoy the novellas. I think they're a lot of fun. It's nice to have something to read in this universe that doesn't require you to give up like the next 6 months of your life. Right. So it's a nice low stakes way to like dip your toe in this world. And you know me, like I'm like a slut for backstory. Like I'm here for whatever thousands of years of nonsense history is going on. But I also like don't understand or can like keep straight any of it because again, all of these people have names that rhyme or are the same as other people or almost the same as other people. And that's tough for me. But I do enjoy, a big, dumb sex idiot running around with like a small, very, very smart child. Like, I think that's like that's a winning combination, whether it's a sitcom or a novella. And I enjoy that as our entry point into all of these shenanigans. But like, yeah, no, Dunk is fully a sex idiot. Like, he is the dumbest thing ever. And I think my favorite thing about the novellas that I didn't really realize until this reread was that it's basically Forrest Gump in that, like, he just accidentally bumbles his way into, like, super important historical moments.
Oh, man, it is.
What the story is actually about is the history moments, like, more than, like, the super dumb guy who's living through all of them.
There in the background,
right.
yeah.
Right. So once I got to the third novella on this reread, which was, like, 4 hours ago or something. I was a bit of a slacker this time, but once I got to that, I was like, oh yeah, he just happens upon this because he is like constantly like either failing upward but in an enjoyable way, or just literally just like tripping and falling into important moments in history. So now that I tied this to Forrest Gump, I love it way more.
I will say that has also like enhanced it in my feelings as well.
Yes.
I appreciate that connection. I mostly enjoyed this. I think my feelings are pretty similar to Mari's in that, like, I was happy to be back in this world, and I am very, very impressed with the scope of the thing that George R. R. Martin has built here, and with his ability to like construct this very elaborate puzzle. I continue to not really care that much for his style of writing in general, and like actual character building, I think often is like lost in service of the larger puzzle. But I was very, very happy to be back in this world. And it was fun to come at this after having read, all of the books, and then to be able to, with the reveals of who people were and whatnot, to like look at the family trees and like get it, like to be able to look at that giant chart and get what I was looking at. I think that is something that jumps out at me, in part because I have said this before, that I started watching the show originally with DVDs that I was gifted, and the DVDs come with like an insert that has like a big fold out like family tree, basically, of all the different people. And like there are pictures and names and like lines connecting lineages and stuff. And so that is like how I was introduced to the show from the jump, and it was super, super valuable as a way of being able to watch the show, although up to a point, because like sometimes the little pictures, I was like, I don't know which bearded white man is on my screen and which bearded white man is in my picture, unclear. But anyway, all of that is to say that to now get to like the other side of this, of like however many years ago when I was first looking at that like weird little fold out insert thing, to now be able to look at this like shoddy MS Paint complete Targaryen family tree that I looked at, and like I could look at it and be like, oh yeah, I have a ton of context for these names, so that was something that was really, really cool and made me all the more appreciative of just like the scope of this thing. So for the most part, yes, I liked this. I have the audiobook. I'll probably listen to it again because, as Sam said, it doesn't require 6 months of my life. Like I can listen to it in the background while I'm doing dishes or whatever, and it'll be nice and fun. I want to talk a little bit more about Dunk, I guess, as a good starting point, just because we already started down that road. How did you guys feel about him as our protagonist?
I think that it was interesting for me. I read the first two on a combination of audiobook and through the book that I checked out from the library. And then at some point while I was like going back and reading about who I was reading about and like looking through the genealogy and all of that, I realized that these were also made into graphic novels. So I read the last one as a graphic novel. And that's, I mean, what I had in my head about Dunk wasn't right. And then you go to the graphic novel and it's literally like rippling muscles everywhere, which then like in context, it makes sense. Like Sam was saying, like, everyone's hitting on him. Everybody who sees him is like, whoa. So all of that like makes sense. But because he was just kind of, slowly plodding along his own plot. I just saw him as more like a gentle giant. I don't know why. But anyway, all of that to say, for, I guess, I don't know, it's interesting. His progression is really interesting, knowing like where he ends up, that he does, I assuming you guys know this too, that he ends up as like head of the King's Guard in the future. Like,
right.
And so, you know, coming from being a hedge knight, and it's questionable about whether or not he was even knighted. He says he was, but then getting all the way to like being head of the King's Guard, and then just like seeing his progression and kind of like lucking into all of this. And he fights a lot, but he gets hurt a lot. Like he's not necessarily very good at this. I think that's a funny story. I mean, entertaining at least. So I didn't mind Dunk at all.
I think I agree that, like, once I saw the, again, like, practically pornographic image of Dunk that's depicted in the graphic novels, I mean, wow. But it like does help the story make more sense, because you do better understand, like, oh, it's like really hard not to just stare at this dude and drool. But like when you're in his head, like he's so dumb he doesn't even know he's hot. So like it's not a thing when you're inside his brain, which I think is like a little bit of a blessing and a curse. Again,
after writing George R. R. Martin, like George R. R. Martin's writing of some of the other like terrible dudes in his universe, can you imagine how he would write Dunk if Dunk knew he was hot? No, thank you. I'm not interested.
I mean, he would be book 1 Theon, like or like book 2, like it would be terrible. But instead, we kind of never have any idea what's going on, because neither does he, and so that helps us be surprised by some of the reveals that, like, for anyone else, like, living this scene with him would be like, seriously, Dunk? Like, pull it together. Like, how did you not know what's going on? So yeah, I think I enjoy him as our entry point. There's definitely some just like cringeworthy stuff that is not enjoyable, but I think for the most part, I like this big dumb brain we're in.
I think it's also neat to like see from the perspective of like he has Egg with him, and Egg will eventually be king, and see like, you know, this big lunk take Egg through scenarios where you almost see like the life lesson, and you're like, this guy is teaching him Egg's things, and he's not smart, but there are things and moments that you're like, you know, that will 100% shape who Egg is as a person. And I don't know much about like his reign and what happened, but you've got to imagine that like slumming it basically, you know, or going around the kingdom, and some of the things that Dunk says to him, even things like, if we murdered or took the heads off of every liar, there wouldn't be anybody left in the 7 kingdoms. And so that's the kind of stuff that you're like, aw, you got some wit to you, Dunk. And that was like interesting to watch.
Wit might be putting it a little bit, like might be overstating the case a touch, but I do think he does have a very particular kind of sensibility, which we don't really see much of in the other, 5 A Song of Ice and Fire novels that we've read, because most of those main characters are highborn. And so the fact that he has seen like a fair amount of the world, he hasn't crossed the narrow sea or been above the neck, but like, he traveled quite a bit as a squire, and then, now as a hedge knight himself. And so he's seen and experienced a fair bit, but he's seen and experienced it as like the common man. And we've seen the ways in which that is kind of hinted at and alluded to in the other novels, but we get it very, very directly in front of center here. And so the knowledge that he is able to bring to the table is stuff like that observation of, all the heads you'd have to chop off to achieve that end, and just like a general awareness of, I forget who they were talking about, but the guy who had one of his sons fought like for the Blackfire Rebellion, and one was against it and whatever. So as a way of like splitting, and he and Egg have this conversation about how like Egg sort of describes that as being craven, and Dunk is like, I don't know, there's like a measure of practicality to that, like that when you are the pawns of more powerful people, like you have to make sometimes difficult decisions, and like these ideas of nobility and honor are a little bit more fraught and complicated when you don't have all of the the power that someone like Egg does. And so all of that stuff is really, really interesting to see with Dunk, and I liked the way that played out. And yeah, I don't know, he's lovable in his way. Like I said, the last one was the one that I was a little bit frustrated and like, wow, dude, wow. But for the most part, he is fine as a protagonist. I don't know how well this would hold up without knowing where we're going. I truly don't know. That's not even, me making a judgment call. It's because I can't separate out the idea that we know going into this, once all the identities are on the table, like we know that this is the future king and the future head of his Kingsguard. And like we're seeing them very, very far from that place. And currently they're in positions where that future is unlikely at the very beginning of the novellas, especially like, even Egg is is not promising in the line of succession to become king. And so to me, that is much of the appeal of like following both of these characters in this particular moment. And I don't know how well they would hold up without that future knowledge.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought up the point about Dunk's background, because one of the things I love most is that this is one of the only perspectives we get in the whole series, including, those 5 giant books, where the point of view is a common born person. Mm-hmm. Like we get in Davos's head, but by the time we're in his head, he's already a knight, an important knight, becoming hand of the king. If we had met him when he was 19, that's, I mean, he's much smarter than Dunk, but like, that's the kind of, I don't want to do a disservice to my uncle, the Onion Knight, by comparing him with Dunk. But the point is that the only point of view characters we get in the books from people who are lowborn are when we meet them at the height of their power. When we meet them at the height of their power. Sorry, I forgot how to talk. And that's Davos and I guess Melisandre. But to get an actual normal, non-noble person's take on, the Game of Thrones, as it were, and to have the lens of like this little boy who doesn't know a lot about the world, but does not know a lot about the politics. Like, that's a really fun way to enter this space, I think.
I agree. And I was thinking about the same thing, just because some of those prologues that we did get were from the perspective of some people that were lower born or not, of the nobility or whatnot. And they're always portrayed basically as rapists. It was always like a rapist, like thinking bad.
Yes. Literally every time.
Yeah. So to have like Dunk, who has his code of, his moral ethics, and he's a knight, and regardless of if he's missing the point, he's trying to do the right thing. And he always, stands up for what he believes is the right thing. So it's like, oh, okay, George, that people who are poor can be good. I didn't know you knew that before. Right. So that's an interesting perspective. And I think I agree with you, Nicole, that having the future knowledge, like this is the correct order for me to have consumed this. Obviously, I mean, just thinking about like having the full story of what we have in the present and then going back to this and then seeing, knowing that they're reaching an end. That's what makes not only the story of Duncan and Egg interesting, but all of the details, right? Where some of these details, annoyed me in the main, but here, I don't know, they all felt like Easter eggs. And every time it was like somebody Stark, I was like, oh my God, I know them.
The whole like series of, the whole collection of novellas is a giant Easter egg. Yes. Like that is the appeal of the thing, is that. It's like, oh man, and now this reference that I totally get, and this reference that I get, and whatever.
I want to just pull out my absolute favorite example of that. So, again, we're starting about 90 years before the events of the Game of Thrones. So anyone in this series who's older than that is fair game to be a character in these novellas as well. And that includes Walder Frey, who was maybe a toddler in the third book. Because
a screaming toddler?
Yes.
A screaming toddler who is described as chinless and hideous, which I enjoy the shit out of. Because, like, as far as the book is concerned, like, he's a baby. Like, he's a toddler. He's a child. He has done nothing wrong. But we all know he's going to grow up to be the fucking worst. So George makes sure that Dunk is like, this baby's disgusting.
Fuck that baby. Yep.
Fuck this baby. He's terrible. And I'm just completely and totally here for that.
Walder Frey has been ruining weddings and family gatherings since he was a wee child.
Yeah, for literally a century. It's an impressive record. I think part of why these perspectives work as an entry point into the story, especially with what you both were saying about going in with the knowledge that eventually Egg becomes King Aegon and Dunk becomes, Sir Duncan of the Kingsguard, is that we already, whether we realize it or not, have a really emotional attachment to Aegon in this story. When Maester Aemon is dying and is, kind of dreaming and prophesizing and not really sure what's going on around him when he's on the boat with Sam and Gilly, he keeps getting Sam confused with his baby brother Egg. And he's all, he looks at him, he says, "Egg, I dreamed I was old," which, like, still to me is the most haunting sentence in the billions and billions of sentences we've read in these books. And, that is such a moving moment to me. And, like, your heart just latches onto that. And so to meet that Egg as a little boy, and talking about his big brother who got sent to the Citadel, and how Aemon measured Dunk and found that he was 6'11", and just like little references, naming his mule Maester because of his favorite big brother. Like there's so much warmth and like goodwill that I already have towards Egg before we even realize who Egg is, and I just like that. And mostly like Maester Aemon is like, bar none, the best person to ever be in this series. And so any reference we get to him, I'm just like, oh, yay. That's my champion. That's literally the best, just the most good person who we ever meet in any of these books.
So I guess we haven't really talked that much about Egg specifically and how he's the other half of this Dunk and Egg novellas, and how we all felt about him. I have to say, I also read them both listening to them and reading a book that I checked out from the library, except for the third one because I also was slacking and I had to go for a run today, and I was like, well, I'm out of time to both sit down and read side by side and go for my run, so I guess I'm just gonna listen while I run. But the first two books I was reading like a physical copy from the library, and there's all these drawings throughout. None of those depicted Dunk as like quite the same pornographic, rippling young man as the graphic novel.
You mean he's not Gaston in any of those little sketches?
Just so we're clear. But Egg, the drawings of Egg reminded me a lot of Aang from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And then I just kept being disappointed in Egg for being not as good as Aang, which is like not a fair, that's not fair to Egg as a character. It's not fair to like any character really, because Aang is great. But also like it was a thing that I could not get out of my head, and I found it deeply distracting.
I mean, he's also like bald on purpose because he's like shaving off his white hair, but 100%. I had in my notes like, is Aang? Aang question mark?
Aang?
Yeah. But I think that the key here is something that Sam mentioned, but it's like how Egg is going around with Duncan and he's got all of the political knowledge, right? And there's a scene specifically like Dunk can't read. So he's like, Squire, come pick out this word for me. Yes. And then he like reads the whole thing. That moment was just such a like, oh my God, I love it. It was so, it just depicted very well the dynamic between the two of them. And I liked, for as much as Egg is this little princeling and that does come out of him, but he wanted to do this. He ran away. He wanted to squire. Mm-hmm. Like he's doing the thing. He's in the mud. He's sleeping on the ground, even though he would prefer a pillow, as we all do, Egg, So I thought that I liked him. I thought that he was also a really good entry point into the story. And it showed the two halves of that. If you're going to have like the lowborn, with a high morals kind of like riding around the country, to then have, the little princeling with all of this knowledge that he's been taught by his parents or his father, and everybody about how we do things. I think that really matched up well.
I will also say that as much as I was distracted by wanting him to be Aang and him not being Aang, I did still like Aang as a character. And I also think it's interesting, too, from, again, the perspective of having the future knowledge. Like, a lot of my appreciation from Aang, I think there is plenty to appreciate in this character and all of the reasons you just gave. Like, yes to all of that. But I think for me, honestly, even the bigger thing is a sense of how much this is not a character who ever wanted to be king. It's like he's all the things that he's doing, he's not interested in, like getting married and whatever, like that kind of stuff comes up. And obviously he's an 11-year-old boy, so like whatever. There's a little bit of tension around that with like that, but also we know all of the many family members that had to die before he becomes king. Mm-hmm. And like, without reading, I assume Fire and Blood probably also gets into some of that, like, what those pieces are. But like,
no, Fire and Blood just gets into the 100 years before that, and all of those same named people.
George.
You don't. Okay, I can't go to Fire and Blood right now.
I'm furious now. I'm also. It's fine. Whatever. Okay. We know in this book, because like, the names do come up, right? Even just from reading this, even without like looking at the family tree or whatever, you hear the names of all of the family members of his that would have to die before he becomes the king, which we know that he does. So like, there's that. And it's clear that like, that is just not something that is on his mind at all. Like, he's not even looking forward to, being like lord of a castle or whatever, so that I think is really, really interesting to see in this character, that like, he is also getting, as you both have already said, he's getting like this really important training for when he does eventually become king, even though that's clearly not a future that he is chasing.
We've been talking about how, Dunk and Egg kind of knowing the future forms their story. But I think one of the things that like is being foreshadowed here that was really interesting to me, just not only for the foreshadowing but because of the commentary, was the whole Blackfire Rebellion thing, and the way that we keep hearing about how, regardless of what side you fought on, one side was going to be a loser, and had it been the other way around, like the winning side would have been the loyalists and not the other way around. So that like view of like war was really interesting. And I know we talked a little bit about how the lowborn are the pawns. You have that whole scene where it wasn't the Blackfire Rebellion, but with Sir Eustace, I think his name was, where he just pulled these guys from the village and they were all like ready to die basically because they didn't know how to fight. So seeing that dynamic, but also knowing that in the future, maybe the Blackfire Rebellion is like a thing that's coming up again. Like, that was super interesting to see it continue to be talked about in this. And I don't know, is he trying to tell us something? I feel like he's trying to tell us something.
This seems like a good time to talk about Bloodraven, aka Brynden Rivers, who, kind of looms large as a presence over, most of the novellas, but especially the third one. What in these texts, in these novellas, is that Brynden Rivers is the Hand of the King. He was one of Aegon the Unworthy's great bastards. So that means Aegon the Unworthy was the king who had like a bajillion bastards and then legitimized them all on his deathbed, just to fuck with everyone. And that's what ultimately led to the first Blackfire Rebellion. So Brynden Rivers was one of these bastards. He had a highborn mother, and his father was Aegon the Unworthy, but he sided with the loyalists and became Hand of the King. And people are just super squicked out by this guy. He's described with a lot of weird death imagery. There's the repeating refrain of the thousand, how many eyes does he have? 1,000 eyes in one. People think he can like turn into mist and talk to birds and change his face and control wolves. And it's like, well, we've never heard of any of those things happening in this story. So that must not be true. But we do get a physical description of him in the books, which is that he has a missing eye, pale white skin, pale white hair, and a wine-stained birthmark across his face in the shape of a raven. Wow, weird, because that old tree dude that Bran talks to in a werewood, like, cavern, who is like a corpse who's also in a tree, also says his name is Brynden, and he also has a missing eye and a wine-stained birthmark across his face, and he also is associated with, like, ravens and blood and weird death imagery and werewoods and all this stuff. So, the fun, like, secret third character who still exists in A Song of Ice and Fire and who is also present in these novellas, in addition to World's Worst Baby, Walder Frey, and World's Awesomest Person, Maester Aemon, is Bloodraven, who ultimately we know to be the Three-Eyed Raven.
I did not make that connection, and
it's
my mind
really
is
hard.
blown.
It's really, unless you're really steeped, I think it's very difficult to make that connection, because I knew that, and then in writing my notes for this chapter, or for this podcast, I was like, wait, how do we know that? And I had to Google, like, what is the textual
what's the evidence
for this? I was like, I know we know this, but I don't know why we know this. And it is literally the same physical description, plus the Three-Eyed Raven telling Bran that when he was born, his name was Brynden. So that, I think, is an important thing underscoring what we were talking about earlier with, like, the point of these novellas is not what happens to Dunk and Egg within these stories. The point is, you know, part who we know that Dunk and Egg will eventually be, and part, like, the political and magical turmoil happening in the background that reflects upon what we're now experiencing in A Song of Ice and Fire. Again, I think this is a series in which history is always repeating itself, and you can feel so many ties between what we read in these novellas and stuff we know is going on now, and whether that's, like, just different, like, heroic archetypes or pairings of people that feel familiar. You know, Dunk and Egg feel like some sort of combination of Arya and the Hound and, like, Brienne and Pod at points. There's so many different little things that you read in these novellas, and you're like, oh, I know that guy in A Song of Ice and Fire too. And so to have the Three-Eyed Raven in his human form be, like, kind of a looming presence over this story, and also already be sparking rumors amongst people of, like, all this magical stuff that he could do. And, like, who knows if he even had these powers yet at this point in his life, if that was just rumors that followed him because of how he looked, but he did end up, you know, becoming powerful afterwards, or if he really is, like, was already, like, warging and maybe also face changing and is Faceless Men now related to the werewood and old god stuff? Like, what's the thing there? So, like, again, this, like, just kind of spools and, like, spills into 1,000 other different, you know, things that become possible. And that is, I think, again, popping out of all of the backstory in these novellas is, okay, yeah, like, Dunk and Egg are fun, but, like, this is so not about them.
Right. So this is, like, what I actually really want to talk about. I feel like we've sufficiently covered the events of the novellas and Dunk and Egg. Like, that was fun, but, like, actually what's interesting here is all of the bonkers theories and all of the, like, you know, weird sandbox shit that this gives us to play with in terms of, you know, what kinds of foreshadowing do we see. And some of it is super literal, like what you've described in terms of, like, you can draw parallels. Like, you know, let's not, like, you know, making, you know, guesses at, like, what might be coming. Like, there are very clear parallels between some characters in the novellas and some in the larger novels. And whatever. But I feel like there's also potentially foreshadowing for, like, a lot of bigger stuff too going on here. So, like, Blackfire Rebellion, question mark, like, that kind of stuff, I think, is what is actually the most interesting part of this.
I immediately was like, I need to know theories, because there is that feeling of not only, like, oh, I know these names, but, you know, I've read through the series one time each book, and it's a ton of information. And I felt like I was, like, grasping at things I kind of half knew. So I had to go to the internet and be like, internet, what are you thinking? And the internet is thinking a lot, let me tell you. But
wow. Okay, so I'm sorry. I literally just Googled theories, and I already found one that's not even a theory that blew my mind, and it's that the Red Widow is Tywin Lannister's grandmother.
Yes.
What? Okay, so I'm so sorry. That was, like, such a tangent, but the point is, like, even the non-theories, just like, hey, this is who is blood related to who, are fucking mind-blowing.
Yeah, so like
I love this.
The Red Widow, like the whole thing is that like she stays married to whoever that one night and until he dies, and then she marries like Tywin Lannister's grandfather, and then that's how that like line continues, which I'm like, makes so much sense. I love it.
Yep, great, sure, of course.
My personal favorite, however, is about in the Hedge Knight. So the whole like tournament is being played at Ashford, and it's like to celebrate his daughter's 13th name day. And so she ends up with like a bunch of champions that are fighting on her behalf or for her name or whatnot. And so they are Lionel Baratheon, Leo Tyrell, Tybolt Lannister, Humphrey Harding, and Prince Valar Targaryen. And somebody out there made this connection to Sansa and all of her people that she's been either married or betrothed to. So it's Baratheon, which, yes, she was first engaged to Joffrey, and then a Tyrell, so she was supposed to be wed to Willis Tyrell, and then a Lannister, and now she's married to Tyrion Lannister, and now she's betrothed to Harry, and so the only one left is a Targaryen. And who is that Targaryen? Like, that's the whole... Like, everybody thinks it's Griff, young Griff.
But it's actually Dany!
Yes! Dany! Yes. It's actually Dany. Dany. Yes. Like, Tumblr, I've mentioned this a couple times on the show, but like for the longest time, my knowledge of the books came largely through just the people that I happened to be following on Tumblr, and you know, like the weird fanish like rabbit holes that you fall down from like getting that perspective of things, and then being surprised by how little of like what I saw on my Tumblr dashboard, like, oh, this is literally like a crumb that you are clinging to in the books, but I don't care. I too will now cling to the crumbs. My one true pairing, my like the OTP of my heart, the improbable and impossible ship of Sansa and Dany, and I love this theory with my whole heart because it's a new breadcrumb to add to my collection, and it's great.
I mean, I love this breadcrumb more than thinking it's going to be her brother John. So, Dany. Another really fun one, I guess, in looking back at like all of the times that Duncan was mentioned in the main novels, his sigil is like mentioned by Brienne, and she remembers seeing it specifically. And so now there are theories about somehow Duncan being her, or like not necessarily being her father. I think that's too close, but that Brienne is somehow related to Duncan the Tall.
Oh, I love that too.
I love that one. I love that it's part like beautiful, like based on something she saw in her father's hall, a shield that like is described to look like his. But I like that most of this theory is just based on, well, they're tall.
Yes.
So like obviously they're like like I love both of those things equally.
Hello, they're tall.
And also like while Brienne is nowhere near as dumb as Dunk by any stretch of the imagination, she does have like sort of the same like communication struggles that he does. Like she finds it really, really, really hard to just like go up and talk to people, finds herself tripping on her words and kind of not linking things together as soon as she should, especially when we see her like first going out to look for Sansa on her own. She can barely string two words together. And so there is something that feels similar about the two of them. And also, even though neither of them are technically knights, right? Like we all most people tend to feel that Dunk is lying about actually having been knighted by Sir Arlen. And Brienne, of course, is a woman and therefore can't be a knight. But like they're truer knights than any of the knights we see in these stories, because they actually will fight against really powerful people in order to save the innocent or in order to rescue someone who didn't deserve to be hurt. And so I like that it makes my headcanon happy to think that Dunk could be like Brienne's, I don't know, great uncle or whatever.
The results are in. You are the father, Dunk.
The 23andMe test came back, and we have confirmed.
Oh man, Westerosi 23andMe. Oh dear.
I mean, there wouldn't be books, right?
Right.
We would just, everyone would know everything.
It's true. It's interesting. Speaking of like, there wouldn't be books if, but like it was interesting to go back and like be back in this world and again keep having all of the thoughts of like, if so-and-so wouldn't have done this, or if, somebody else wouldn't have done that. And there's like a whole passage where Sir Eustace in the second novella is like reflecting on the Blackfyre Rebellion as like, if this had been different, like literally anything on a long list, if any one of those things had been differently, then like the outcome would have also been different. And like I have that is definitely something. There is a like, I don't know, sad cloud that kind of hangs over the experience of all of these books. And I don't say that in a bad way, but it's like part of what you're signing up for when you venture into this world. And I kept even reading, because of all of the parallels happening in the novellas, all of the parallels to things in the other 5 books that we've read, I kept having, again, thoughts of like, oh man, like if this character, if Tywin hadn't done this or whatever, I don't know, being back in, there's a whole like ambiance to it of like sad foreboding that I don't know where I'm going with that. Maybe I have to scrap this whole thing.
No, but I feel what you're saying. And I think there's another part towards the end of the third novella where Dunk is thinking about how, so, the knight he originally served, the hedge knight he grew up with, was Sir Arlen. And Sir Arlen only needed a new squire because his nephew squired before him, and his nephew died in the first Blackfyre Rebellion. And Dunk realizes, like, that's the only reason I'm here. If Sir Arlen already had a squire, because his hadn't died in the Blackfyre Rebellion, he never would have picked me at a flea bottom, and I would be dead or on the wall by now. And so thinking about that and how just the cascading consequences of every micro decision that's made, I think is like brings a lot of layers and richness to the story.
My point was mostly just echoing all of the ways like there wouldn't be books if, but like you can't help but want that version,
Yes.
you want that for these characters, even though you also acknowledge that the books wouldn't exist if.
I think there's even like a larger view of that in the first story when they fight like the 7-on-7 or whatnot, and the really cool Targaryen prince dies, and everyone's pretty bummed about that. And so like somebody says the gods would take away the prince and leave like this hedge knight. Why? And so like the look of like, that entire idea of like who lives, who dies, that whole thing I think is pretty.
Who tells your story?
Yeah.
I was going to say it.
Yep. Thanks, Hamilton. That is really present. And I think that it is part of like the ambiance of A Song of Ice and Fire, is that you could die at any moment, but all of those deaths ripple and like then have all of these consequences or whatnot. And yeah, man, we dove head first right back into that death and sadness. So cool.
Cool.
Hey, but at least we get probably my favorite line from the third novella, which is when John the Fiddler, aka whatever Blackfyre, tells Dunk that we're going to howl together and awake the very gods, which I'm like pretty sure is a cut line from Out Tonight from Rent. Like what a way, like what a line to just super hit on this, very buff, dumb stranger. I don't know. I love everything about that line.
I don't have anything quite so poetic to take us out on. I have no other cut lines from Rent, but I think that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much to Sam for joining us again to talk about all things A Song of Ice and Fire. We would love to hear all of your thoughts about all things A Song of Ice and Fire. There will be a post dedicated to this episode up on SnarkSquad.com. You can also join our community on Patreon, where we've got polls and bonus episodes and other fun stuff at patreon.com/SnarkSquad, or you can find us on Twitter at @Snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Marines.
And I'm at Democracy Diva.
Thank you, as always, to Steph Chen for the delightful theme music that is playing us out right now, and we will be back in your podcast feed again next week. Bye!
Bye.